Hello friends, this video on Neet evolution is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. The next factor is heredity. What is heredity? In simple words, it is passing of traits from parents or ancestors to offspring. So traits getting passed on from one generation to the next, that is heredity. So looking at this picture, you see a couple and their two kids. So if you see, one of the kids have brown hair like mom, while the other kid has black hair like dad. Right? So these are all traits which are getting passed on from one generation to the next. Now heredity is a very important mechanism of evolution. Now organisms possessing hereditary characteristics that are helpful get favored, and that is how the genetic traits are preserved over generations after generations, and those traits which are helpful, they survive, and that's how with those helpful traits gradually you often come up with new organisms. So that's how heredity and evolution, they are very closely linked to each other. Finally, the next factor would be natural selection. So we know what is natural selection. Natural selection says that nature selects the fittest and eliminates the inferior ones. Now, the natural selection is one of the most widely accepted theory for evolutionary change. Now, natural selection results from differential reproduction. It says that some organisms might produce many offsprings, while some other organisms might produce very less offsprings, while some others might produce less offspring. So, different organisms will produce different, in different number of organisms, and this decides the relative abundance of different genotypes individuals in a population. Like, let's say that if, take any example, let's say that if people with brown eyes are born more. So if you have more and more individuals with brown eyes being born, and if you have people giving birth to blue-eyed children, very less. So what happens? So over a period of time, you see that the genotype for brown eyes are in more abundance when compared to the genotype for blue eyes. So that's how it is. So this is called differential reproduction. That means not every organism would give birth to the same number of offsprings. Some will produce many offsprings, some will produce less offsprings, some will produce very less offsprings. So that concept is called differential reproduction, and this differential reproduction is very closely related to natural selection. So nature supports the advantageous genetic mutations. So let us take the example of giraffe. Now, why does the giraffe have a long neck? Now, the long neck was helpful. So the trait of long neck was preferred or favored by the nature. So therefore, long-necked giraffe reproduced more. So more number of giraffes with long neck were produced. So as a result, when you look today, do you see giraffes with short neck? So they are lost, because nature only supported those traits which were helpful, which helped in the survival of those organisms. Now these giraffes, they needed food to eat. So they generally feed on plants. So if you see, their long neck helps them to feed on plants very easily, because there is not much competition at the top layers of the plants, because not every organism is that tall. So that means long neck of giraffe helped them to get their food easily, helped them in the survival of the species, and that is why long neck trait was kind of selected by nature, because it was found to be the fittest. So natural selection is the process in which organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce offspring. So when they produce more and more offsprings, what happens? That's differential reproduction. So you have more abundance of that particular genotype in a population. So how do you think is natural selection impacting the genetic variation in a population? So obviously natural selection is deciding which genotypes should exist and which genotypes should fade away with time. So that way, it is impacting the genetic variation in a population. And finally, the last factor is speciation. So speciation is origin of new species from existing ones. Now, speciation always sound very interesting, that how is it possible that a new species will arise from an existing species? Now, do you remember the Darwin's finches? So when we spoke about the island where the first few finches arrived, and then they used to feed on seeds. Now, as they kept reproducing, their numbers increased, and they found that feeding only on seeds would make food scarce for them. And that is how, some of them started eating up worms, and their beaks got gradually modified to feed on worms. So they started having longer beaks. And that's how we gradually have multiple species of the same finches. So finches on the Galapagos Island is an excellent example of speciation, where we see that small changes over a huge period of time gradually give rise to new species. Now what happens is, population of a species in different environments, they are separated by barriers, like they are separated by geographical barriers or geological barriers, and as a result the variations are accumulated. That means when you kind of build barriers between two groups of organisms, like as I was telling just now, the isolation thing, then what happens? Those two groups of populations, they are not able to kind of mate with each other, and as a result the variations are accumulated in each population. So all the variations of population 1 are getting accumulated there, all the variations of population 2 are getting accumulated there. So these variations get accumulated due to genetic drift, mutation, etc. And finally, after a very long period of time, you see that the organisms become morphologically and genetically different from each other, and then they are no more capable of reproducing with each other. So they became two different species altogether, and this is what we call as formation of new species from an existing species. So that is speciation. So you see, in speciation happens, and as a result of which the genetic variation in a particular population changes. So I hope you understood the concept. Let's say that earlier all these birds, the two birds that belong to the same species, and you had put a geographical barrier between the two. So this is population 1, this is population 2. Now since you have put this barrier, so all the birds in 1 cannot mate with the birds in 2. So what happened? Now some mutations will happen here, some changes will take place here, some genetic drift will happen here, because all these things happen in all the population. So all these changes will take place in population 1. Similarly, all these changes will also take place in population 2. But all the variations that is happening in population 1 will remain in population 1. All the variations in population 2 will remain in population 2, because there is no interaction between 1 and 2. Now after a very long period of time, you would see that here, even though you started with almost similar organisms, but after a long period of time, here you have X and here you would have Y. That means because of the variations and the small changes that took place over a large period of time, both of these ended up becoming a new organism altogether. So basically these new species which are formed from the original one, that is called speciation. Thank you. Please visit examfear.com for free quality education. You can learn with a simple 4-step learning process wherein you can watch video lessons, you can ask your questions, you can refer notes, and you can take a free online test. We have content for class 6 to 12 on physics, chemistry, mathematics, and biology along with practical videos. So please subscribe to our channel for daily updates. Thank you.